to Tennessee's at-home learning series for literacy. Today's lesson is for all our 6th graders out there, though all children are welcome to tune in. This lesson is the 4th in our series. My name is Megan Gilley, and I am a 6th grade teacher in Tennessee schools. I'm so excited to be your teacher for this lesson. Welcome to my virtual classroom. Today, we will continue learning about the Middle Ages. If you didn't see our previous lesson or lessons, you can find it on the following website at www.tn.gov/education. Again, this is the Tennessee Department of Education's website, and you can use this to look at any of the previous lessons. You can still tune in today if you haven't seen any of our others, but it might be more fun if you go back first and watch our other lessons, since today we'll be talking about the things that we learned previously about the Middle Ages. So today we're going to be taking a look at a little bit of a different reading than we're familiar with, but you're still going to need similar materials. You're going to need 2 pieces of paper, a pen or a pencil, and a firm surface to write on. Also, even though remember that we're reading about the Middle Ages, we're really focusing on as our skills as readers and writers. Really strong readers cite evidence to support the thinking based on the inferences that we can draw from the text, as well as we're analyzing, well, how are key individuals or details introduced and developed throughout a text, in this case, the Middle Ages. And of course, we're still investigating different vocabulary so we can learn new words to help us understand the text. We'll use all the important details from today's reading to then develop ourselves as writers. Our end goal today will be to write a paragraph that explains how towns emerged during the Middle Ages. So let's get started. We have reviewed the Roman Empire and how it changed into Europe under the feudal government. We studied lords and we studied serfs. In our last lesson, we took a look at knights. Today, we'll be reading a little bit of something different. We're going to read a narrative about living in a town in the Middle Ages. We will consider how towns evolved and started to bring a middle class between both the serfs and the lords. Let's begin. It is raining again. You stand in a puddle on the edge of a narrow street. You've just entered through the town with one of the gates. The gates are the only ways in and out of this walled town. Inside the walls, tiny townhouses stand side by side. As you move through the crowd, you spot rats scurrying about, feeding on discarded trash. Nearby, you hear the varied cries of people selling fruits and vegetables, eggs and pies. It is market day, and people have set up their stalls in the town square. As you make your way through the muddy streets, you hear the sound of church bells. They ring out to sound the hour and to call people to the church. You have just caught a glimpse of a town in Europe during the late Middle Ages. So I want you to be thinking about, well, what does this town look like from the descriptions? I want you to think about it. And I could imagine that I wonder why there would have been walls around the town and gates through which everyone must pass. And I'm thinking about what else I might have seen in that small town. I know that I heard gates, I heard walls, rats, discarded trash, people selling food, mud, church bells. So those are the things that I heard and could see around me in this small town. Let's continue. I want you to be thinking about the attributes of towns as well, and how we transition from the countryside manners to towns. So let's move on. In the early part of the Middle Ages, most people lived in the countryside. Between the years 1000 and 1350 CE, fueled by trade, towns began to grow. New jobs emerged, and as a result, more and more people left the countryside to live and work in towns. With this growth in trade, an increased number of people became involved in commerce or business. As a result, a class of people called the middle class grew in importance. Merchants and craftsmen were part of the middle class. Towns grew as the middle class created successful businesses and therefore jobs. Some merchants became rich and influential members of town communities. To protect their businesses, merchants established guilds in towns throughout Europe. As I'm reading this, I'm thinking about, well, I wonder what guilds are. And I'm thinking that guilds were organizations made up of merchants, and I can see that in the text here. Guilds were made up of merchants. Can you find it? Good job. Guilds controlled wages as well as the price and quality of the goods. So when we look at our text, we can highlight the evidence to support this. In addition, I'm thinking about, well, what happened as a result of merchants creating jobs in the town? Well, we can see that some members became rich and influential members of town communities. And I want us to look at the question on the left-hand side. What was the link between trade and a middle class? So again, we're focusing on this question right here. What was the link between trade and a middle class? Let's look here, see if you can find it. You can see all this evidence is supporting that. As trade grew, more and more people became involved in commerce here. With this growth in trade, an increased number of people became involved in commerce or business. And the merchants and craftsmen who were involved prospered, meaning they thrived, they were successful. So they were no longer as poor as serfs or peasants, but they still weren't as wealthy or as powerful as lords. So let's read on to find out more about the middle class. And as we read, I want you to think specifically about the middle class craftsmen. So not only did merchants thrive, so too did skilled craftsmen, such as carpenters, paper makers, glass makers, and blacksmiths. Skilled craftsmen were also important members of town communities. They made and sold their goods in towns in which they lived and worked. Just like merchants, skilled craftsmen protected their businesses by forming guilds. Only highly skilled craftsmen were invited to join these guilds. Many years of training went into becoming a skilled craftsman. There was a certain pattern to daily life in towns in the Middle Ages. From Monday to Saturday, towns were busy with the hustle and bustle of street vendors, shoe keepers, craftsmen, and market sellers. Pickpockets and purse snatchers were afoot, too. Shops opened as early as 6 a.m., and most towns held markets 2 or 3 times a week. Local farmers sold produce and animals. So I want us to think about what types of craftsmen existed in the Middle Ages. And I'm thinking about, well, where in the text could I find the evidence to support the answer to this question? and I'm looking in the text and I see, well, what types of craftsmen existed? Well, here in the first sentence it says, so too did skilled craftsmen, such as, which tells me it's going to list out the different types of craftsmen. Carpenters, paper makers, glass makers, and blacksmiths. Question 2 says, what are pickpockets and purse snatchers? I want you to think about that. Pickpockets and purse snatchers. Think about what it sounds like. Pickpockets and purse snatchers. Well, the way that the words are described here in the text, pickpockets, purse snatchers, and just thinking of what those words mean, it's people who steal things or pick things out of people's pocketbooks or out of people's purses. Why do you think that pickpockets and purse snatchers might be afoot in the town? Thinking about how it says they were afoot too. I'm wondering that they might be in the town because the people walking around the town might have valuable possessions with them. So they're on feet looking for where they can find and steal these particular items from people. We're learning quite a bit about towns and how they're developed. I'm wondering how towns adapted over time. So let's read on and find out. Towns were not outside the control of the local lord. Merchants and craftsmen usually paid lords in the form of money or goods. However, in exchange for money or goods, many lords granted towns special charters. The charters allowed wealthy and influential townspeople the right to make their own laws. Over time, this new decision-making process changed the feudal system. I want to go back and reread the sentence for just a moment that says, however, in exchange for money or goods, many lords granted towns or special charters. I want you to think about what the word charter might mean in this sentence. I think that it means that charters gave people rights, like to start a new town. Many lords granted towns special charters. Something to think about. So as we move on, I want us to answer, well, why might this change in decision-making process change the feudal system? How could the fact that lords granted towns special charters, how might this change the feudal system? I want you to think about that for a moment. Okay, readers, sometimes we have to be able to interpret this information that we read and make an inference. And one of the things I'm thinking is that this might change the decision-making process. It might change the feudal system because under the feudal system, kings and noblemen such as lords paid people who worked for them with land and protection. In turn, the lower ranked people, such as serfs, promised loyalty to the lord. This system gave a lot of power to the lords over the lives of serfs, but with people in towns making their own laws, the power of the lords ends up beginning to weaken. So we can see that in the text here where it says the charters allowed wealthy and influential townspeople the right to make their own laws. So over time, this decision-making process changed the feudal system. Lords lost more of their power because of this. So I want us to continue reading, and I want us to think about, well, how are schools and universities established? With a growing economy, a banking system began to develop. The increasingly wealthy churches and towns created schools called universities. Places such as Oxford and Cambridge in England and Paris in France became important in centers of learning. I want to think about what role did churches play in setting up the universities? I want us to think about that for a minute. You're right. The wealthy churches in town created schools called universities. Now we are going to move on and we are going to read a section, a short informational section, meaning it's true information, called If You Were an Apprentice Craftsman. I want you to follow along with me at this lengthy part of the text. Stay with me, guys. Just like the boys who go off to train to be knights, you, too, are sent away at an early age. Could you imagine that? Your family arranges your training. You must live in the home of a master or a highly skilled craftsman. It is unlikely that you will return home again during your apprenticeship years. Your training, which is an apprenticeship, will take many years to complete. You will not receive payment for any of the work that you do. During this time, you are part of your master's household. You live in his home or shop. You usually eat with his family. And your new family provides the clothes you wear. Even if you are homesick or sad, you have to obey your master. After a specified period of time, you advance from being an apprentice to becoming a journeyman. As a journeyman, you are paid by your master each day for your work. Usually, you continue to work for your master as an employee. After several years as an employee, you might take the next step in your career. You might be ready to submit a piece of your best work, called your masterpiece, to the guild for approval. If the guild accepts your work, you finally become a master craftsman. You might even be able to open your own shop with your name above your door. Wow, so this is quite a lengthy process to becoming, going from an apprentice to a highly skilled craftsman. So I want us to take out a piece of paper and we're going to be jotting the steps. How do we become a craftsman? Over the past couple of days, we've taken a look at how we become knights and the steps to that process. And so today we're going to think about what are the steps of craftsmen. So on your sheet of loose leaf paper in the upper top section is where we will do this work. You will see on your screen that I have provided for you the text there that we can reference to help us. Again, when we think of steps, a good method of note-taking is using boxes and arrows to show steps in a process. So we're going to write the steps to becoming a craftsman. In our first box, I'm going to be thinking about, well, what's the first thing that we did? Very similar to knights. It's that first they left home. So jot that down. The second step to becoming a craftsman was, let me think about that. You had to become somebody that's in training, called an apprentice, and you entered into your master's home during this level of training. Then let's think about the next step in the process, and you can think of that arrow as like the word then, meaning what is happening next. Then they became journeymen, and at this point in their training, they begin to receive money from their master for the work that they're doing. So they are moving up in the process. And lastly, what ends up happening? Well, fourth box, they submit their best piece of work to the guild for approval. And do you know what happens if approved? They become a highly skilled craftsman. And so these are the 4 basic steps. Again, we as readers can read so much information, but it's really important that we pick out the most important details. So in this section, we learned about how towns came into existence. We are going to create a cause and effect chart that shows the factors that created towns. And so I'm going to be showing you what kind of cause and effect chart we're going to create. So the very first box, and I want you at the bottom of your notes that you just took to follow with me, I'm going to draw a box, and excuse my poor handwriting, that says trade, okay? So again, I'm thinking the factors that created towns. Well, first we have trade. Why should I do that? Well, because towns began as trading centers. Next, I'm going to draw 2 boxes. One of the boxes is going to be for merchants, and the other box is going to be for guilds. And I'm thinking, well, why? Well, we needed merchants, and merchants then grew into guilds. So again, when I think of cause and effect, we started with trade, then we had merchants, and then that created and led into guilds. So what should I draw next? I'm thinking, well, what came out of the guilds? We just talked about this, okay? And we have craftsmen is what ended up coming out of the guilds, okay? We have our highly skilled craftsmen. But you have to remember that there are really two levels to this other process. Before they were craftsmen, we just talked about it, they were journeymen. So we want to write that down. Put our boxes. And before they were journeymen, they were first in training. They weren't paid yet. They were called an apprentice. Okay, so out of the guild, we have craftsmen that end up being developed. So I want us to think about, well, where is it? Because don't forget, we had those who were a part of crime, and that was a part of a town, but it wasn't necessarily connected in any way. We always had crime. It wasn't something that was caused by something else. So here we're going to put crime in its own box, and when we think of crime, we're thinking of our pickpockets. So again, be drawing this with us or with me. Pickpockets. And do you remember what else they were called? Those who steal not just from people's pockets, but they snatch people's purses. So we call them pickpockets and purse snatchers. And it's okay if it doesn't fit in your box. A little sloppy copy doesn't hurt anything. And then we also discussed churches and schools. So I'm thinking about, well, I don't know that it would go in the top part of this process, but I think I'm going to add it toward the bottom just a little bit, because off of trade, we have churches and schools. It was another way of learning, okay? Just like today, you can go to school or you can go into a particular trade. So we'll have schools. Actually, we had our churches first, right? And then the churches helped to create the schools. Okay. And here we have our cause and effect chart. I think I have a good cause and effect of all the components of a town that we read about today. Again, really strong readers take all the most important information and put it into some sort of graphic organizer to help collect the key important details. Because then once we have that, we can then use that to become strong writers. And we can use that on our next task. So I want you to use the chart from the previous slide. And today, on your own, independently, you are going to write an informative paragraph explaining how towns emerged in the Middle Ages. Again, be thinking about all the details and all the components of a town. How did they emerge? What did it start with? What levels were there? Who was created next in this step? So consider that visual. That's really going to help you to develop your writing today. I do have a few tips to give you before you begin trying this on your own today. One, review your cause and effect chart that we drew. Again, really strong writers use a graphic organizer that helps to pick out the key important details to include. We don't even include everything. We want the most important information. And two, I want you to turn that graphic organizer into a full explanation of towns and how they emerged or were created or how they were developed in the Middle Ages. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to get started on this task. You may go ahead and begin trying, write an informative paragraph. Informative, we are just giving information straight from that chart. I will say it's not an easy writing task, and that's okay. As writers, we have to begin somewhere. So just be thinking about the multiple causes and components of how towns evolved. You can do it. Again, go back to your chart that you created. Well, writers, I want you to continue working on this task today. And if you need more time to go back and look at the graphic organizer or to look at this particular screen, you can always revisit this lesson at the Tennessee Department of Education's website. I cannot wait to see how you turn your graphic organizer into a full explanation of how towns emerged during the Middle Ages. We learned so much information today. I want to say thank you for inviting me into your home. I look forward to seeing you in our next lesson in the Tennessee's At Home Literacy Learning Series. Have a great day, and I will see you next time.
Before you take a drink, do you think we can make this water rise to the top without putting any more water in there?
Yes.
How?
If we put some ice into here.
How many do you predict can fit in there before it goes all the way to the top?
I think 7.
7? Can you count them with me? Let's count. 1, 2, 3,
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
do one more. Daddy dropped it.
11.
You predicted it would take 7 ice cubes, and it took 11 ice cubes. So, did it take more or fewer ice cubes?
I think more.
You think more? You're right, it did take more. Now, you can take a drink.